Imagine a man so filled with the Spirit of God that the heavens literally open up to fetch him in a chariot of fire. This is not fiction, nor is it an ancient legend. This is one of the most supernatural stories in the Holy Bible. His name? Elias, the fearless prophet who faced kings, challenged an entire nation steeped in idolatry, and called fire from heaven before an incredulous crowd. A man who lived God's mission intensely and left earth without experiencing death. But before the glorious rapture, Elijah faced pain, doubts, deserts, persecution, and even thoughts of giving up. Have you ever felt like that? Like you were the only one trying to walk with God in the midst of a world that chose other gods? This story will show you that even the great prophets face their own valleys. But with faith and courage, Elijah stood up and changed the course of history. In this text-based film, you will immerse yourself in an epic journey from the confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, passing rough prophesied drought, the miracle of flour and oil, the encounter with the still, gentle voice of God in Horeb, until the spectacular rapture of Elijah to heaven. Every scene, every miracle, and every battle reveals more the character of the God of Israel and the power behind the prophets of the Bible. Get ready. This is not just an old story. It is a living call to those who still believe that God raises up Elijah today, ordinary people, but with extraordinary faith. Are you ready for this journey that will give you goosebumps from head to toe? If you haven't subscribed yet, take the opportunity to subscribe now and activate notifications. That way you don't miss any content that can transform your life. Israel was a people who bore the name of the Most High God, the same one who parted the Red Sea, sent manna from heaven, and made water flow from a rock. But over time, that nation that had been called to be a light among the nations began to lose its way. They exchanged the God of Israel for gods of wood and stone, and bowed down before the gods of the Almighty. Altars of Baalan forgot the commandments engraved with the finger of God. It was like watching a fruit tree rot from within. It is sad to think that, even though they were the people of promise, Israel allowed itself to be seduced by the pagan cultures around it. The cults of Baal spread, and the prophets of the Bible began to be persecuted. There was no more fear, no more reverence. The story of Elijah begins precisely in this chaotic context, where idolatry dominated hearts and the truth was buried under profane rituals. It was a nation that knew who God was, but had chosen to forget him. And do you know what's most impressive? The apostasy didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, subtle, almost imperceptible process. Like someone who trades light for comfortable shade, Israel moved away from its identity. And when we move away from God, we make room for anything to occupy the throne of our hearts. The nation that was supposed to carry the revival began to support the altars of Baal. Yet God did not abandon them. His faithfulness never depends on our behavior, and that is why he raised a prophet to meet the crisis. When all seemed lost, when the heavens seemed closed, when the people no longer knew right from wrong, that was when the mission of Phileas, the prophet of the impossible. God always lifts someone up when everything falls apart. And perhaps you are asking yourself, could it be that this time of Israel is not similar to what we're living today? Modern idolatry, lack of fear, exchange values. That is why supernatural story from the Bible told through Elijah is not just memory, it is a mirror. And the reflection we see in the next chapter may surprise us. Israel's spiritual decline was not just a collective mistake, it was a conscious rebellion against the God of Israel. The people who had the Holy Bible as a reference, they began to worship images, get involved in pagan rituals, and despise the prophets. The worst part? This was encouraged by the leaders. When the leaders lose their fear, the people give into chaos. And that is exactly what happened in that dark time in history. Idolatry took over everything. Sacrifices to Baal, public worship and altars of Baal, frenzied dancing. Israel seemed to have forgotten where it came from. The saddest thing is that this apostasy was not limited to worship. It affected justice, morals, and even compassion among the people. The nation that was supposed to reflect God's character was unrecognizable. It was like a house that had been eaten away by moths from the inside. You prophets of the Bible, who still dare to speak in the name of God, were being hunted, killed, or hidden. The word of the Lord was rare, and God's silence seemed deafening. But it was not a silence of abandoned men, it was a silence that precedes thunder. The people may have forgotten the Lord, but he still saw everything. He still had plans. And the prophet Elijah would be God's answer to this corrupt generation. And look how curious the people still maintained an appearance of religiosity. They had parties, rituals, meetings, but it was all facade. Like many today who attend temples but worship the modern Baals in their heart's vanity, greed, pride. Israel's apostasy echoes today, and this is a warning when truth is left aside. Error disguises itself as light, and in this scenario emerges the courage of a man who did not bow down. This context of apostasy is a perfect backdrop for understanding the greatness of Elijah's calling. God did not raise him up in times of peace, but in the midst of chaos. And it is precisely in the dark days that prophets shine the brightest. In the next section, we will learn about the birth of this bold and authoritative voice, the prophet Elijah. If there was a trophy for king most negatively influenced in Holy Bible, Ahab would certainly be among the finalists. He was a typical ruler who had the title but not the posture. Weak, indecisive, dependent on the approval of others, especially his wife, Jezebel. Ahab even knew the God of Israel, but he chose to ignore him to follow the pleasures of idolatry and convenient politics. When marrying Jezebel, a pagan priestess devoted to Baal, Ahab sealed Israel's spiritual fate. Instead of leading the people in repentance, he encouraged the building of altars to Baal and Asherah. The temple of the Lord was forgotten, while field altars of Baal were erected throughout the territory, and this with the king's approval. It was as if a religious leader today were to say, "Let's modernize. Any God will do." But that is not how the God of Elijah operates. Ahab was also manipulative. When confronted, he played the victim. Instead of acknowledging his mistakes, he blamed Others he did with Elias, calling him the troubler of Israel. This reversal of values is typical of weak leaders. Instead of confronting the truth, they try to silence those who proclaim it. Elijah, however, was not intimidated. He knew who he was dealing with. And what's more, he knew who was with him. Governments like Ahab show how the heart of a nation can be destroyed when its leadership turns away from God. It's not just a political issue, it's a spiritual one. When the top is contaminated, the poison trickles down to the bottom. It was in this environment of cowardice and permissiveness that prophet Elijah stood out with boldness and fear, a stark contrast to the limp king who was behind the throne. Ahab's weakness set the stage for the epic clash that was to come. A king dominated by a pagan queen, a divided people, and a prophet willing to face it all for the love of truth. And the story is only beginning to heat up in the next section. We'll delve into the dark and manipulative role of Jezebel's woman behind the chaos. Jezebel was not just a beautiful and influential queen. She was dangerous. Coming from Tyre and Sidon, it brought with it the worship of Baal, a pagan practice full of immorality, human sacrifices, and spiritual manipulation. Her marriage to Ahab was strategic, not for love but for domination. She didn't come to adapt to Israel. He came to transform Israel in his image, and he almost succeeded. As soon as she came to the throne, Jezebel began to reconfigure the religious landscape of the people. She ordered the construction of temples, raised the altars of Baal, installed images of Asherah, and financed 850 false prophets, 450 of Baal, and 400 of Asherah. He was a truant to revival. Instead of repentance, promiscuity. Instead, the God of Israel, a false God who answers nothing. And the people, seduced by the power and banquets of the prophets of Baal. But Jezebel was not just an idolater. She was a persecutor. Her mission was to eliminate any trace of the worship of the true God. She ordered the killing of the prophets of the Bible, banned the worship of Yahweh, and established fear. Many remained silent. Others hid. Anyone who did not accept Baal as their Lord was considered an enemy of the state. The story of Elijah intertwines with this dark scenario, where a woman determined to destroy a nation's faith reigns unopposed at least, until Elijah shows up. Jezebel also manipulated her husband like someone moving pieces on a chessboard. When Ahab wanted Naboth's vineyard and couldn't get it, she hatched a plan, set up a false trial, and had the man killed. This shows that she not only influenced, she gave orders, a controlling spirit of rebellion against God, who would not accept being challenged easily. That is why her name has become synonymous with spiritual manipulation to this day. But for every Jezebel raised up in history, God also raises up an Elijah. When all seems lost, when truth seems forgotten, it is at that very moment that heaven responds with fire. And before that happens, it is time for the prophet to appear unexpectedly, powerfully, and boldly. And that is exactly what we will see in the next point. And then, in the midst of a people in crisis, surrounded by idolatry and led by a weak king, a different man appears. Without much introduction or genealogy, he suddenly appears on the scene like a thunderclap in a clear sky. We are talking about Elijah the prophet, a simple man from Tisbe, without titles or inheritances, but carrying the fire of God of Israel in the heart. One of those who doesn't just talk in fronts, doesn't just pray, makes heaven move. The first appearance of Elijah in the Bible is already shocking. He addresses King Ahab directly and, without beating around the bush, declares, as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, there will be neither dew nor rain except at my word. Just like that, out of nowhere, no ceremony, no request, just the authority of one who is connected to heaven. And as he himself had said, the heavens closed. Then begins a period oft-drought and famine, an Israel of visible judgment against hidden idolatry. For 3 years, the land groans under the weight of lack of rain. The fields dry up, the livestock dies, and hope also begins to wither. But while the people look to Baal for answers, nothing happens. No sign, no miracle. After all, idols are mute. It is in this context that the figure of Elijah becomes even more contrasting a man alone, but in tune with the true God. Miracles of Elijah would begin to sprout precisely in times of scarcity. The name Elijah means the Lord is my God, and he embodies this truth in a radical way. He makes no alliances, does not negotiate with Jezebel, and does not fear the king's threats. He is the kind of person who disturbs people simply by existing. Wherever he goes, there is either conversion or confrontation. You cannot be neutral in the face of someone who carries such a divine presence. He was raised as a response to apostasy, a prophet who carried within himself not only prophecies, but a call to repentance. Elijah's appearance may seem sudden, but in fact, it was planned by God from the beginning, because when all seems lost, heaven does not remain silent. Elijah was God's trumpet for Israel, and when the drought became severe and the king wanted to kill him, the Lord moved him to a hidden place, a place where new miracles would happen. And that is exactly what comes next, after the bold declaration before Ahab. Elias receives surprising guidance from God. Go and hide yourself by the brook Cherith. That's right, the man who defied a king now needs to retreat quietly. It's curious how God of Israel alternates between moment of action and reflection. Sometimes the battlefield is a palace, other times it is an isolated stream. But in both, God is present. There, in hiding, an essential phase of story of Elijah. No Rivero de Carite. The prophet experiences a continuous miracle. He is fed by ravens that every morning and every evening bring bread and meat. Have you ever thought about that? Ravens, birds unclean by Holy Bible, obeying the voice of the Creator to sustain a man of God. This reveals how the Lord uses even the unlikely to accomplish his purposes. Elijah was not just being protected, was being trained in total dependence, a true spiritual retreat. The water from the stream quenched his thirst, and food came from the heavens, an echo of the days of manna in the desert. The lesson was clear: when we obey, God provides. Perhaps you too are in a time of Cherith, where everything seems still, hidden without a stage or an audience. But know this: it is in this place that the giants of faith are shaped. It was there in the silence that the prophet Elijah was strengthened to face even greater challenges to come. This period shows that not every miracle involves crowds. Sometimes, the supernatural happens in the silence of everyday life. Eating bread and meat twice a day, delivered from heaven by birds, is a clear message: those who walk with God will never be forsaken. And Elijah learned this in practice, drinking water from a simple stream and trusting in the faithfulness of the Almighty. It is in this environment of solitude that the prophet's heart beats stronger. But like everything in life, even the miracle of provision had its end. The stream dried up. The drought he prophesied has now reached him as well. It was time to take the next step. And once again, God speaks. But now, the direction is unexpected Sidon, a foreign territory outside of Israel, and there a new miracle awaited him, involving a widow and some flour and oil. Let's find out what happened next. With the stream dry, God of Israel sent Delius for an unlikely mission to go to Sarepta in the territory of Sidon, the same region as the Queen Jezebel, the prophet's fierce enemy. It seems contradictory, doesn't it? But it is precisely in this pagan place that the Lord reveals his grace. God sends him to the house of a widow, someone marginalized in the culture of the time. What does this teach us? That miracles of El Ejado not depend on status, but on obedience and faith. When Elijah arrives, he finds the widow gathering sticks. She is about to prepare the last meal for herself and her son afterwards. They only await death. It is in this tragic scenario that the prophet Elijah dares to ask, "Make me a cake first." What kind of request is that? Selfishness? No, it is faith in action. He knew that God of Israel does not abandon those who trust in him. And by obeying, the woman becomes part of a supernatural miracle of the Bible. The miracle of flour and oil is one of the most symbolic off-story of Elijah. Day after day, the jar did not run dry. The measure was never lacking. It was enough. It didn't overflow, but it never ran out. This reminds us that divine provision often comes not in excess, but in just the right amount. And the miracle continues as long as obedience lasts. What a powerful lesson for anyone living with anxiety or fear of scarcity. But God had more to reveal. The widow's son fell ill and died, and then we saw something that had never been seen in Scripture before Elijah cried out to God, lay down on the child 3 times, and life returned. Resurrection of the widow's son not only brought comfort to that home, but further established Elijah's prophetic ministry. It was as if heaven were saying, "This is my servant, and I am with him," a foreshadowing of what Jesus would do centuries later. This episode marks a turning point. Elijah goes from being a prophet of drought to an instrument of restoration. He, an Israelite, blesses a foreigner. And with this, God demonstrates that his grace has no boundaries. Power is not in place, but in presence. And even outside of Israel, the true God acts with authority. Little did Elijah know that he would now return to the most tense confrontation of his life. He would face King Ahab and the 450 prophets of Baal. After years of drought, tensions in Israel were at their limit. King Ahab went out in search of pasture and water for his animals, while the people suffered. It was at this moment that Elijah reappears and, before confronting the king directly, meets a curious character, Abdias, Ahab's steward. Even though he served the royal household, Obadiah was a God-fearing man of integrity in the midst of corruption. He had hidden 100 prophets of the Bibline, caves to protect them from the wrath of Jezebel and Baal. Imagine Abdias' fear when he saw Elijah in the Bible before him. It wasn't just reverency, was dread of what might happen if he handed over the prophet and he disappeared again. "Do you want to kill me, man of God?" He practically says in other words. Elijah, with his firm faith, calmly responds, "Tell Ahab that I will come forward myself." Here we see the contrast between a man dominated by fear and one guided by faith. Abdias, despite his fear, fulfills his mission. And this is something we need to note. Faith is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act even when one is afraid. Elijah assures that he will fulfill what he promised. He does not shy away from confrontation. The time for hiding is over, and now it is time to face Israel's corrupt system head-on, a system led by a weak king and a manipulative queen. This reunion between Elijah and Ahab is charged with tension. Ahab calls him the troubler of Israel. The king's audacity is almost comical. He who destroys the country with idolatry and injustice accuses the prophet who announces the truth. But Elijah does not back down. With a firm voice, he returns the accusation, "It is not I who trouble Israel, but you and your father's house, by abandoning the Lord's commandments and following his psalters of Baal." This moment is crucial for the history of Elijah. The climate of confrontation is set. On one side, the prophet Elijah, alone, representing the God of Israel. On the other, the king, his advisors, the deluded people, and the false prophets. Everything is about to unfold in one of the most impressive episodes of Holy Bible. And the stage will be the Mount Carmel, where the spiritual destiny of a nation will be put to the test. We have reached the most electrifying moment of the history of Elijah the clash in the Mount Carmel. Imagine a scene, O prophet Elijah on one side, alone, and on the other, for 50 prophets of Baal, with all the pomp of pagan religion, a true spiritual duel. Elijah proposes a simple but powerful challenge to God, who responds with fire from heaven will be recognized as the real one. A direct confrontation between the God of Israel and the false gods. The people watched in silence. There was anticipation, curiosity, and tension in the air. Prophets of Baal, they begin their show. They shout, they dance, they cut themselves a chaotic scene, a veritable circus. They cry out from morning until evening, but there is no response, no fire, no sign. The altar remains untouched. And Elijah, with a slight touch of irony, he asks perhaps he is sleeping or traveling. There was no lack of courage and confidence in this man of God. The point here is much more than spiritual pyrotechnics. What was at stake was the heart of a nation. Israel had strayed into idolatry, exchanging living truth for seduction of falters of Baal. Elijah wanted more than a miracle, wanted revival on Mount Carmel, wanted to rekindle faith in true God, the one who had freed their ancestors from Egypt. By rebuilding the Lord's altar with 12 stones, one for each tribe, Elijah was reminding the people who they were. They were not followers of Baal. They were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. A short but faith-filled prayer, answer me, Lord, so that these people may know that you are God in Israel, and that it is you who turns their hearts back to you. And this is where the plot gains a new rhythm. Anticipation grows, people hold their breath. The skies grow quiet, and something great is about to happen. Elijah's faith is about to be answered in a supernatural way, and an entire nation is about to be impacted. But, like every good story, this part deserves a separate chapter. After Elijah's firm and faith-filled prayer, the scene changes completely. Suddenly, fire descends from heaven in an overwhelming manner, consuming not only the altar, but also the wood, the stones, and even the water that Elijah had poured around it. It is a supernatural spectacle that leaves everyone speechless. This moment is not just a show, it is the indisputable confirmation that the God of Israel is the true and sovereign on earth. The people, who until then had been divided, no longer had any doubts. In unison, they exclaimed, the Lord alone is God. The declaration marks a turning point in the history of Elijah and throughout Israel's history. It is a time of revival, a call for the people to abandon their altars of Baal and return to the living, true, and present God. Faith, which seemed to have been extinguished, is rekindled with intensity. Elijah, with divine authority, not only witnesses a fire fall, but also acts firmly against idolatry. He executes the prophets of Baal, responsible for leading the people astray and establishing spiritual corruption in Israel. This action shows that the spiritual battle against falsehood is not easy, and that the true prophet must be bold in defending the truth. This episode reveals a practical lesson: genuine faith is powerful, but requires courage to confront the structures that insist on keeping people trapped in lies. Elijah, as a true spiritual leader, is not afraid to act to purify the environment and renew the commitment to the God of Israel. It is a call for us also not to be afraid to fight for the truth in our midst. That fire that came down from heaven is a symbol of the supernatural power that God offers to those who sincerely seek Him. What came next, the return of rain, and the end of the drought, is a reward for faith that did not give up. But before we talk about that blessing, we have to understand what happened to Elijah after that explosive moment in the Mount Carmel. After witnessing the powerful fire from heaven, Elijah knew that the time of drought was nearing its end. He climbs to the top of the Mount Carmel and begins to pray fervently. His faith is so great that he is not content with little. He wants visible signs to show the people that the God of Israel is still in control. After all, 3 years of drought and famine have tested everyone's patience. Suddenly, a young man sees a small cloud, the size of a man's hand, coming from the sea. It may seem insignificant, but Elijah understands it is the announcement of the end of the drought. For him, that small sign carries the weight of great hope. All of nature seems to be preparing for a new time, for the restoration of the earth and life. This is the beauty of prophecies of Elijah, simple signs that bring great changes. The rain begins to fall, at first timidly, then heavily and abundantly. The dry and cracked earth rejoices. The rivers flow again, and the people experience the rebirth of divine blessing. This rain represents more than water. It is a symbol of God's mercy that renews hearts and revives faith. It is a moment of victory, the fruit of perseverance and trust in the Lord. In addition to the natural aspect, the return of rain has a profound spiritual impact. After proving that the God of Israel is the true one, the people were called to renew their commitment and abandon idolatry, especially the promoted by Jezebel and the worshippers of Baal. Elijah not only brought rain to the land, but also the promise of genuine revival. But the life of the prophet Elijah was not limited to moments of triumph. Soon after this victory on Mount Carmel, he would face a period of deep fear and discouragement, fleeing from the threat of Jezebel. And that is exactly where the next part of the story begins. Supernatural story from the Bible takes us. After all the victory on Mount Carmel, Elijah didn't have much time to celebrate. Jezebel, the pagan queen and fierce enemy of God's prophets, threatened to kill Elijah, showing that the spiritual battle was far from over. Even with the fire from heaven and the rain that restored Israel, the persecution continued strong, and Elijah felt the weight of loneliness and fear. Discouraged and exhausted, Elijah fled into the desert, looking for a place to hide and even asking God to let him die. Who has never felt this way when faced with difficulties, right? But the story of Elijah shows us that even great prophets go through moments of weakness, and that God does not abandon us in these dark hours. In the middle of the desert, an angel appears to sustain him with bread and water, a simple but powerful care that keeps Elijah alive and strong for the mission that is yet to come. This miracle of divine provision is a clear reminder God cares for his servants even when all seems lost. It is an invitation to trust in the sustenance that comes from heaven. This episode in the desert reveals the humanity of the prophet Elijah, who, despite his unshakable faith, needed to recharge his strength. Holy Bible does not hide these moments. On the contrary, it brings them so that we can learn that the spiritual journey has ups and downs, and that seeking help and rest is essential. As Elijah recovers, the story prepares us for the next supernatural encounter, which takes place in Mount Horeb, where Elijah will experience a very special way of hearing the voice of God is still. Small voice that will forever change his perspective and mission. In the desert, Elijah arrives at Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, a place loaded with meaning for the people of Israel. There, they seek the presence of the God of Israel with an open heart, but what he finds defies all expectations. Instead of powerful winds, earthquakes, or blazing fire, God reveals himself in soft and gentle voice off a delicate breeze. This moment is remarkable because it shows that God does not always act through grand and noisy manifestations. Sometimes a quiet whisper is where we find direction, peace, and the strength to carry on. Elijah learns that listening to God requires inner silence, attention, and humility, a valuable lesson for all of us in days of constant noise and distractions. There, God gives Elijah a new mission to anoint kings who would do God's will, and to appoint a successor, the prophet Elisha. This calling shows that spiritual leadership is a shared responsibility, and that renewal comes when we pass the baton to those God raises up. Elijah, even at the height of his mission, knew that his work was not alone. The meeting at Mount Horeb also symbolizes a new chapter in the story of Elijah, where he is strengthened to face the challenges ahead. After the confrontation on Mount Carmel, the discouragement in the desert, and the gentle voice at Horeb, Elijah becomes a living example of perseverance, trust, and unwavering obedience to the true God. It's an invitation to reflect at what moments in our lives are we listening to loud, noisy voices, and when are we paying attention to the still, small voice of God? Learning from Elijah can be the key to finding clarity, peace, and purpose in the midst of the storm. Elijah's story doesn't end like most of our stories, doesn't experience death, for he is taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, in a scene that defies imagination. This episode marks the rapture of Elijah, a unique and supernatural moment that reinforces his special role as one of the greatest prophets of the Holy Bible. It is no wonder that his story is one of the most impressive in the Old Testament. As he ascends to heaven in a chariot of fire, Elijah leaves behind his mantle, a symbol of spiritual authority and power. This mantle is received by his disciple Elisha, who now receives a double portion of the prophet's spirit. It is the passing of the baton the mission and the calling, reinforcing the continuity of divine work among the prophets of the Bible. This rapture symbolizes much more than an end. It is a sign that Elijah's mission has been accepted by God and that he has been taken directly into the presence of the Lord. It is a clear demonstration of the power and sovereignty of the God of Israel, who performs miracles in amazing ways to teach us eternal lessons. For those who follow the story of Elijah, this scene is a reminder that true faith and obedience bear fruit that goes beyond earthly life. Elijah became a reference for later prophets and for the New Testament itself, where his figure appears at decisive moments, showing the legacy and importance of his ministry. This supernatural ending inspires us to stay focused on the mission, to trust in God's promises, and to believe that even in the face of great difficulties, the supernatural can happen. What can we still learn from Elijah? The answer lies in the next part of this fascinating story. After knowing the whole journey of Prophet Elijah, from the challenges with Ahab and Jezebel, to the miracles in the wilderness and at Zarephath, to the heavenly rapture, the question remains, how can we apply this faith and courage in our lives today? Are we ready to hear the soft and gentle voice of God amid the noise of the world? How can we face our personal Mount Carmel? By trusting in Him, God of Israel, who does the impossible? I invite you to reflect on this and seek the same spirit as Elijah in your life's steadfastness in the mission, perseverance in adversity, and the certainty that the supernatural can happen. How about starting today to make room for the silent voice that guides and renews? And if you want to follow more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Let's go together on this journey of faith, knowledge, and transformation. Leave a comment telling us what impacted you most in Elijah's story. I want to hear your opinion.